So, one focus of my recent research is the relationship between emotion and food intake, especially in people's natural environment. So, for a given individual, when they become upset, perhaps in response to an interpersonal stressor, such as relational aggression, do they eat less or do they eat more, perhaps even to the point of engaging in binge eating? And what I'm going to focus on today is the measurement of food intake. So traditionally, food intake has been measured with self-report. There are a variety of different types. This is an example of a food record. Not surprisingly, you record your food intake along with some approximation of the amount. And this is very burdensome, especially if you're having to do this over a period of weeks. I have tested it out myself, and I can assure you that by week 3, I was seriously considering eating peanut butter and jelly for every meal so that I wouldn't have to write as much. But most people do find this burdensome. And scientifically, although there's certainly great value in people's perception of how much they're eating, if what you're trying to look at is their actual food intake, we know that there is considerable measurement error. And it's not just random, it's systematic, so there's bias. And the average person tends to underreport their food intake. So they report eating less than they actually are. This can be because they leave out food items unintentionally, intentionally, because they underestimate the portion size, or because they misreport items. And in one of my favorite studies, dietitians were asked to keep 7 days of food records, and then their average caloric intake or energy intake per day was compared to a gold standard measure. And what you can see is that even the dietitians, so if you look at the red line, that would be perfect reporting, you can see that most of the dietitians fall below that line. They're underreporting. And so if dietitians can't report their food intake accurately, there's probably little hope for the rest of us. And so we actually know that in this study was about 10% underreporting, but depending on the population you're looking at, it can range between 0 and actually 60% underreporting. So people can be reporting less than half of what they actually ate. And so what's even worse than the fact that you have systematic bias or systematic error or bias is the fact that that bias is correlated with the very psychological variables you're interested in. And even worse than that, that correlation differs across the groups you're interested in. So there are many examples of this. But in this study, women who were at higher weight, the more depressed they were, the less they underreported, to the point where for individuals who are very depressed, they were actually slightly overreporting their food intake. And so in women who were not at higher weight, this relationship didn't exist. There was no association between their depression level and the accuracy of their self-reported food intake. And so this is obviously a between-person relationship, but what if this happens within person? So what if when I'm more upset, I overestimate my food intake, and when I'm not upset, I underestimate it? So then, even in the absence of any real relationship between negative mood and food intake, there would still be a spurious correlation simply because the degree of accuracy changes with mood. And so you would draw erroneous conclusions. So this is obviously a very, very big concern for my area of research. And with self-reported food intake, there are some other scientific concerns. One is reactivity, so the degree to which your behavior changes while it's being measured. It's a little bit difficult to speak to this because almost all studies of food records, food recall, are conducted in the context of weight loss interventions. So that's a little bit of a different question than when you're just keeping a food record outside the context of an intervention. But it does seem that even outside an intervention, people do eat a little bit healthier and a little bit less when they're keeping food records. But whether that's due to the fact that they're keeping a food record and they're perhaps more aware of what they're eating, or the fact that they just know they're being monitored more generally, is hard to say. And so lastly, with food records and other forms of self-report, there's very little concern about the generalizability of your sample because almost everyone can engage in one form of dietary self-report. And so when you sort of summarize the different disadvantages and advantages of self-reported food intake, you see the biggest concern is measurement error, followed by participant burden. And there's really not many ethical concerns. Occasionally, someone who has an eating disorder will experience a worsening in their symptoms as they begin reporting their food intake, but that does not happen very often. And so the major concern has been measurement error, and people have proposed a myriad solutions to this problem, but the one I'm going to focus on today is the use of wearable cameras to passively monitor food intake. And so in the long term, the goal is to use these cameras to largely replace self-report. At present, they're mainly used to augment or improve self-report. And the cameras are worn on the body, typically the chest. They have a wide-angle lens, and some of them are video cameras that record continuously. Others take still photos every, say, 5 seconds. And so it's still really too early in this area of research to draw any definitive conclusions, but so if you look at the bars all the way over on the right, look at the black bar. So the black bar is showing the degree of underreporting for men when they just use self-report. And then the bar next to it that's gray is the underreporting that happens when they use self-report aided by the images from the wearable camera. So as you can see, the degree of underreporting is much reduced. It doesn't disappear, but it's much reduced. And that's largely due to the fact that a lot of items that are omitted in food records are captured by the camera. And here you can see all those items. So the limited amount of existing research suggests that measurement error is improved. There's a little bit of evidence that reactivity might be even greater when people are wearing cameras. They're even more likely to try and eat healthy or eat less. But one concern that doesn't exist with self-report is lack of generalizability. And I joke that when I tell people about this area of research, I get a bimodal distribution of responses. So some people say, wow, that's super cool. I would love to do that. And then other people say, wow, you've just described my worst nightmare. And so that is borne out by, so the plural of anecdote is not data, but that is borne out by actual data. So about a third of potential participants, when they hear there's a wearable camera involved, no longer want to be or no longer interested in the research. And that is largely due to concerns about privacy. And so the crux of the concerns over privacy are that the camera captures not just the salient event, in this case food intake, but it captures everything in front of the lens at every moment the camera's on. And so this can be fairly innocuous, but you may also end up capturing things that your participants or the people around them do not want you to see and that you may not want to see. And so that can include people's personal financial information. That can include evidence of crimes, including some that are reportable. And so when I think about it, I divide the ethical concerns involved in the use of wearable cameras into 3 categories. So the first are privacy concerns relevant to the participant. So in addition to capturing their food intake, you're capturing all their other behaviors, potentially private information. But even worse, you may be capturing the images and private information of third parties. So the friends, colleagues, strangers who interact with the participant who have not consented to be in your study. And so lastly, related to these third-party privacy concerns, there are also concerns of doing harm to the participant because they may encounter third parties who are very upset that their photo has been taken. And additionally, there can be legal consequences of taking people's photo without their consent. So In Massachusetts, Chapter 272, Section 105, specifies that if you photograph someone who is nude or partially nude without their consent, you can be imprisoned and or fined. And so there are also concerns over civil liability aside from these criminal concerns. I will say, as a statistician, this is a low probability event. And in fact, none of the research that I've read has reported any participants who ran into extremely aggressive bystander reactions or legal consequences. But it's important to be aware of this. And so the researchers who have been in this space have given a lot of thought about how to ethically address these concerns. And I'll refer you to these two very excellent papers. And I divide them into three different areas. So you can effectively mitigate ethical concerns through your research protocol. So for instance, you need, as in every study, to fully inform your participant, tell them, and that includes how many photos you're taking, that the photos might include pictures other than food, that the photos might capture events that you might be mandated to report to the relevant authorities, that people might get upset at having their picture taken, so on and so forth. You also should, through your research protocol, specify that you will give the participant time to review the images and delete them before you, as the researcher, look at them. So they can delete anything they want to. And you should not distribute the images. And that includes to the participant. So a participant-based solution to mitigating these concerns would be turning off the turning off the camera prior to entering a setting where there might be privacy concerns. It could also include asking permission from your colleagues, the people you live with, so on and so forth, before you use the camera. And lastly, there's some researcher-based solutions which would amount to effectively going through all of the images, obscuring any private information, and then extracting just the salient images that contain food intake and passing only those images on to the individuals who are doing the coding. And that's obviously very time-consuming. So it's about apparently 8 hours per day per participant. And so in summary, I'd say that most of the recommended mitigation strategies increase the participant and the researcher burden at present. They may also increase measurement error. So if you think about it, if the participant is having to turn off the camera every time they might encounter a privacy concern, invariably people will forget to turn it back on, and then you may miss episodes of food intake, which was the whole problem you were trying to avoid in the first place. And so to end this talk, though, on an optimistic note, and one that is germane to the topic of this meeting, I'm actually very optimistic about the possibility that technology will solve these problems. So, for instance, technology might be used to prevent these problems with privacy before they occur. So to give you an example, these are chokers that contain a microphone or something that detects vibration, and this can be used to trigger the camera only in response to episodes of eating. So as you can see, this would greatly reduce the number of images that don't contain eating but do contain privacy concerns. And so there are also post-hoc solutions that apply after you've collected the photos. And so these basically amount to using a software that automatically processes the image to either extract just the food images or obscure the private information. And so this is a summary of the strategies. If you look in the upper left quadrant, those are the photos you want to keep. They contain pictures of eating, but no privacy concerns. And the bottom right quadrant contains the photos you really want to get rid of or not have, which are photos that don't contain food intake but do contain privacy concerns. And in this study, they looked at how do each of these automatic processing strategies do at keeping the photos in the upper left quadrant while getting rid of the problems with those in the lower right. And as you can see, they help to some degree, but they're nowhere near completely effective. But I'm very optimistic that over time, a combination of these preventive and post-hoc strategies can be used to effectively mitigate any ethical concerns without a great burden on the researcher or the participant or without compromising scientific measurement. And so on that note, I'd like to thank my collaborators and my funding source and all of you, the audience.